If you were a small town priest, what would you ask the Pope? What would I ask Arnold Steinhardt about violin, about teaching to get the most out of your students, about recording for passion rather than perfection? This and more inside Music Un-Tuxed. Welcome, everyone, to another episode of Music Un-Tuxed, where musical excellence and community building come together. And today I am so thrilled to have our special guest with us, Arnold Steinhardt. Arnold Steinhardt is world renowned as the first violinist of the Guarneri Quartet for 45 years. I have to say, I used to talk about Mr. Steinhardt to my students as the god of the violin for me, the god of chamber music for me. So I'm looking at this conversation almost as if, let's say, I am a priest in a small town. Well, I might be talking to the Pope right now. So, so, so I'm
You're
going.
embarrassing me, Michael.
Was that enough of a setup for you
Oh, I've never been compared. Even my mother wouldn't go that far.
I am welcoming you with just open arms and heart, and it's so great to see you again too after a number of years. So welcome to Music Un-Tuxed.
Yeah, and you never know what a student is going to do, how a student is going to develop musically, instrumentally, just that student's position in the world, and it's been a thrill to see how you blossomed. And I mean, one way I think of all of us in the world is how useful are we in our society, and aside from being inspirational, just on a basic level, if we can be useful in our community, to our profession, I think, inspiration comes or doesn't come, and I'm sure it comes with you, but I am so touched that you've been such a powerfully useful person in your community, Michael. So I congratulate you.
Well, thank you, because so many times ego can get in the way of great teaching, or yes, my question would be to you is, how do you have that balance of greatness and humbleness to provide to future generations like you do?
Well, when I was teaching you, or any of the students that I've had over the years, I don't walk into the lesson thinking I have to be great or I have to be humble. Again, to my last point, Michael, I have to be useful. And that's why I found that a full day of teaching for me was always exhausting, because you have a responsibility on your shoulder. I mean, somebody's coming to you who is by definition gifted. Otherwise, I wouldn't be in a position to teach that person. And someone who's gifted needs to be, that gift has to be nourished. And by nourishing it means you have to search, and you find ways not just to feed information. You hold the bow differently, or that phrase could have been more interesting musically, but you have to encourage as well as being useful. And that's a different model than the old-fashioned model that I suffered under, and everybody in most people in my generation did, because I got beat up a lot, not
Hmm.
literally, but figuratively by my early teachers, and they were great teachers and great violinists. But the idea was, if you can survive me, you might have a chance at a career, because the music business, is a tough one and an uncertain one. And it not only requires artistry and perfection as far as you can make it perfect, what you're doing, but it requires motivation
Hmm.
and in certain ways a tough skin, which
Yes,
is not what we think of as artists, but that has changed, and thankfully so. So again, once in a great while, I've made a student cry. I felt terrible about it because I thought I am trying to help that student, but um, sometimes the truth hurts.
it does. And sometimes crying is not a bad thing.
No, it happened very rarely for me to make one of my students cry, but it just happened,
Yeah.
and I wouldn't have withdrawn what I said because I was trying to say the truth, to
Hmm.
administer because the truth might hurt and be destructive in the short run, but one hopes that in the long run somebody says, "Oh, I, I've got to accept that and deal with it."
Hmm. I would love to hear about some of the major influences, or maybe one that really made a huge impact. I know there are many, but if you could.
Well, as a teenager, between the ages of around 14 to 17, I studied with Tosche Seidel, who was one of Leopold Auer's great students, along with Jascha Heifetz and Nathan Milstein, Ephraim Zimbalist, Misha Elman. And incidentally, I was reading about Leopold Auer, and he didn't talk about technique with the students. He
Hmm.
talked about artistry, and he was a string quartet player. I found out, I didn't really realize that to what extent he was. But anyway, Tosche Seidel would yell and scream at me on occasion, and then he would say, "Sit down, let me show you how it should be done." This
Uh-huh.
particular piece of Bruch or Mendelssohn or Tchaikovsky. And, in a way, he was a terrible teacher. And in a way, he was a glorious teacher because he showed me the way it should be played. And
Hmm.
obviously, I had to find my own way, but it showed me a way, a hugely successful way that this music could be performed. And
Hmm.
it was interesting because my next teacher was Ivan Galamian. And Galamian was, in his way, just as scary because he was such a great teacher, but he was a very quiet man.
Hmm.
So he would say, "Arnold, I think this phrase could be much better when you play it." And I couldn't hear the end of what he was saying because
Oh,
the sentences just sort of disappeared in his throat.
do you think that was intentional?
No,
No. Okay, it
no,
was it.
he was just bound up in his own thoughts. But it was just scary because you knew that everything he said that you could hear
Mhm.
was of great import.
Yeah.
And so, I mean, these two teachers, one following the other, both had a huge effect on my technical and musical abilities
Hmm.
uh, as a musician. I mean, you can go on YouTube and hear Tosha Seidel.
Yes.
It is hot playing. When he demonstrated for me, I thought his Stradivarius was going to melt like butter on the
Wow.
floor. It was passionate, it was free, it was full of truth, his
Truth.
truth. Yeah, and it was thrilling, just thrilling. And then, my last teacher was Joseph Szigeti, who was a quiet, thoughtful man, a philosopher of sorts. But as a philosopher, he was very much involved in violin technique, which surprised me because when I listened to him in person, I had the privilege of doing that once, and in all the records that I loved of his, you had the feeling this was a man who understood music at a deep level and had something personal to say that was different from everybody else who played the violin. And I think, I mean, you can't do that artificially. It has to come, deep inside you. But he certainly had that. And it was a thrill to have just one summer studying with him. And to my surprise, he talked about music, but he talked about music in violinistic terms. He would say, I think this would be the flute in the orchestra. And as the flute, I wouldn't play that on the A string, I would play that on the D string. So it was just another complete way of looking at music. And when we're young, or maybe I'll just speak for myself, when we're young, we're enthralled by different violinists. So when I was young, I wanted to sound exactly like Jascha Heifetz, which was, of course, impossible. Only Jascha Heifetz. But I would try all his slides and all his fast vibrato, and then it was Fritz Kreisler, was playing the Schubert A major sonata, the duo that he recorded with Rachmaninoff. I used all the same slides because it was so seductive.
Yes.
So I want to be like Fritz Kreisler, and so it went, as a student, and then you began to find your own way. And my own way, I guess, if you listen to me on record, you say, "Oh yeah, that sounds like Steinhardt." But the one who I came closest to, just musically, temperamentally, I think, was my last teacher, Joseph Szigeti. I mean, I don't want to sound like him. He, just like everybody else who's a great violinist, nobody can sound like Szigeti except Szigeti. But everything he touched had such profound meaning, whether it was the Prokofiev First Concerto, whether it was Mendelssohn Concerto, Brahms Concerto, which he recorded 3 different times. Everything he touched had a magic to it. You had to stop and listen to it. Sometimes, I used to think the violin was a very difficult instrument, and I've changed my mind because every single soloist on the stage today plays the violin fantastically. So obviously I was grossly mistaken.
It's not a difficult instrument.
But sometimes on the radio, I'll hear a splendid performance. The other day, I heard a splendid performance of the Dvorak concerto on the radio. And I thought, that's fantastic, but I wouldn't know who's playing it because it was kind of generic. It wasn't unmusical. It was musical up to a point, but I didn't feel that person, I didn't know who that person was.
Yes, and your recordings are clearly you. I mean, I can hear your
better. And
well, for better and amazingly better.
Thank you. But that's one point in working with students. A student will play a phrase, and I'll say, you played that very well, but I didn't know who was playing. I didn't know it was you. I want you to show yourself. So sometimes I feel that we're not violin teachers, we're not music teachers, we're psychiatrists. You know,
Definitely.
Who are you? Show yourself. But that's scary because what I showed you, Michael, you might think, oh yeah, I saw who you were and I hated it.
Well, you have a career spanning close to, well, if we start when you made your debut with the LA Philharmonic, I mean, it's close to 7 decades. I recently revisited your Violin Dreams book where it has the CD, and in the back of the jacket cover that has I believe the recording from 1966, the year I was born, and then from 2006 of the same Bach partita. And you can hear the evolution.
I often think of the way you sign your name, and it's kind of an automatic thing, but the way you signed your name as a kid, as an adult, as a young adult, and then it changes. It changes, and you're not saying, well, I'm 33 years old, I'm going to change my writing. I'm going to change my autograph. Who thinks about those things? But even, I mean, you've acquired experience writing your name.
Yes.
And without conscious thought, it changes. So I don't know that you or I or anybody else starts a day of practice and saying, well, I'm practicing Beethoven's first violin and piano sonata. I'm going to try and change it. I'm going to be a different person than I am. It just doesn't work that way. But the way you played the first sonata when you were, let's say, a student of mine, and the way you play it now, it's a compilation, a confusing compilation of all the music you've heard that has nothing to do with the first sonata, perhaps. And it goes on that way. As far as recording, I think I talked about it in the book.
You did.
About the 1966 recording, because I think recording is so dangerous. You think this is for an eternity, it's forever, which is nonsense, because a record is interesting when it's new, and then other new recordings come, and then this is replaced and basically forgotten about. So it's a performance, but we see this cold microphone there. And when I was recording the Bach sonata and the Bach partita, I was all alone except for the engineer. And while I was playing, he was reading the newspaper. And I thought, oh, come on. I'm trying to play my heart out, and you're reading the newspaper. And I complained about this to my friend Lincoln Mayorga, who was the producer of this record. He said, all right. Tomorrow you're going to have an audience. So the next day, his mother showed up.
Oh, that's great.
Nancy Mayorga. And she sat there in a chair, and that's all I needed, because there was a live human being who understood and loved music. And so I was happy. I assume the recording went much better because of that, because of the human element. And that brings me back to the point that you're not playing for eternity. It's a performance. And there's a very famous pianist who's now retired. He's still alive. I won't mention his name. And one of the Schubert 4 sets of impromptus, I heard a recording, and I thought it was just perfectly played and rather cold. And I thought, who is this? And then his name was mentioned, and I thought, well, it was a recording that he had made of the impromptus. And it was disappointing to me because it was careful. And, anything of Schubert is sheer poetry. Not that long afterwards, on the radio, I heard the same set of impromptus, and it was gorgeously played. And I thought, who the heck is this? Obviously not the same person. And it was the same person, but it was a recording of a live performance.
Right.
And I mean, he should have, because of his great artistry and because of his great experience, he should have known at that point that he should have just let it go. And there's some artists who can let it go in front of a mic, and some artists who just rather freeze up.
Mm-hmm.
And I mean, the crowning example for me is Jascha Heifetz. And his playing on record is hot.
Yes.
Always hot. You know, sometimes I listen to it and I want to talk to him. Jascha, don't start so fast. You're going to be in trouble. No, Jascha, don't do that. You could start slower and it's going to be just as impressive. And then I say, Jascha, you made it.
Mm-hmm.
Wow. So he
Yeah.
was one of those people who could do that. And I found when I started recording on my own or with the quartet, I had to fight against the carefuls.
Yes.
Just play it safe, Steinhardt. Don't take any chances. And then when I would hear these playbacks, I said, "Oh, why didn't you do it? Why didn't you give a little bit more?
Mm.
Why didn't you show more of yourself?"
Yes.
And so I learned about that. And an RCA recording producer, Peter Delheim was his name. And he would say, okay, take one. And we play it. And then afterwards, Michael Tree, our violist, would say, I don't hear enough viola. I said, we'd rearrange it. Take two. Somebody else would say, you know, the Allegro sounds a little logy. We should have a livelier tempo. Take three. And so take three would be further adjustments. And then Peter Delheim would say, Guarneri String Quartet, take four. Gentlemen, it's time to gird your loins. which is an amusing way of saying, guys, now it's time to go for it.
Yeah. Right.
Gird your loins, gentlemen.
Yes. Gird your loins.
I love that expression.
Oh, that's great. And a lot of the recordings that you've made, I know you appreciate the on it, like not having a lot of edits in them. Like I think there are a few recordings that you specify there are no edits. Like I think is there a recording? I seem to remember Strauss. Did you do the Strauss and
yeah? Oh well, that was direct to disc recording.
Direct to disc.
No tape recording. There was, I think, 25 minutes of recording. And this was the era of long playing records.
Right.
So the record would come out of the cake is baked, they would say, because they had this acetate record that had to be perfect. And then they would put it on. And this is when Lincoln Mayorga and I recorded the Strauss Sonata and what else?
I think the Dvorak. 4 romantic pieces.
Yeah, romantic pieces.
I think that's the album I'm thinking about.
So you just had to go for it.
I love that.
And it was a completely different feeling. And Lincoln told me that the old timers who recorded for 78 records, where you had to play for 4 or 5 minutes, they were much more comfortable with this direct-to-disc process because they knew that they had to play to a certain standard and that there was no splicing.
Mm-hmm.
And that newer musicians freaked out at the idea that they couldn't splice, they couldn't correct their mistakes. They were much more uncomfortable with it. Mm-hmm. So we had to become comfortable with it. And it was a great experience. You know, I think Lincoln screwed up and then I screwed up and they said, all right, stop stop the machinery. We
Yeah.
have to start from the beginning again.
Yeah.
And it's exhausting. So we had to record, I think, at least twice the Strauss sonata. But, you know, when you listen to that, you weren't listening to a recording, you were listening to a live performance.
Right. Right.
The recording. And that was a big difference, I thought.